I'm honored to introduce Dr. Susu Nousala from the Tongji University. Dr. Nousala has uh, developed, developed systematic project-based learning programs, concepts and practice with several international partners. She has chaired and co-chaired numerous international symposia and conferences and co-authored more than 60 reference journals, conference papers, and book chapters. Today, Dr. Nousala's topic of discussion is the art of systematic learning and practice. Welcome, Dr. Nousala. The stage is yours. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much. Very kind of you to invite me along today. So I just want to sort of introduce myself a little bit about why systems and where did this come from, and why is a person whose PhD came from aerospace, advanced mechanical engineering, ending up in a design school. So the background is the undergraduate was in fine arts and preservation and conservation of cultural heritage. The master's was in business, knowledge management, and community of practice. And then the aerospace advanced mechanical engineering PhD in soft systems. And it sounds like it's all very disconnected, but in actual fact, a lot of these things do have a common thread going through them. My common thread is the sort of, I have great love and passion and interest in the way knowledge works, both in a tacit, meaning something that you can touch, and the tacit, something you can't touch, and more the knowledge that you can. So I'm going to go through what does that mean. And the way I approach knowledge and the way I approach systems and subsequently design in terms of how we put all of those elements together is because design is an excellent place to practice many aspects of things that we need to bring alive. So those of you who are in design understand all the premises that you need, the elements you need to pull those things together. And what does systems and knowledge have to do with that? I'm going to go through a little bit of history about what systems and design, where they've crossed over in the past, and why that has such a big influence and impact today. There has been a history of systems and design. And right from the beginning, as you can see from here, it's systemic. It's not systematic. Systematic is quite a different term. Systematic means that's like step by step by step. That's quite a linear process. When you get into systems, they're quite a living thing. And the background to the areas of systems that I work in is the social complex adaptive systems. So I'm looking at adaptive systems. This is quite different from the experience between design and systems in the past. And this is actually something that I want to bring up and have a conversation today, because this is very new current work about the fact that systems design or design systems, and there's so many different ways that you can put that. So we all know that design has many different connotations. You can say policy for design, design policy. They're all different things. The way in which we put our terminology is very important because it changes the meaning completely. Systems is no different. So as people who may want to just practice, or those who wish to perhaps go further and become scholars and researchers, you will still need the fundamentals as to what we're talking about. So that's why I talk about a process for this session, because it's only, we only have a short time together. So, and this is a very complex and very deep topic. And what I want to do is give you the fundamentals without watering down the topic. Can I just have an indication, the speed at which I'm speaking? Is it clear? Is it too fast? Is it too slow? Any idea? Seems all right? Okay.
Perfect, yeah.
Okay, good. So difficult, people, because you know you're in a black box to me. You know, you're just a screen. So this is the world of Zoom teaching. So here we go. So first of
But the
all,
screen, yeah, madam, your screen is not very sharp. So, is there any setting you need to do, or we have to do?
my screen's very sharp.
Now now I can see. Now I can
Oh,
see.
okay. Okay, good.
Thank you. Yeah.
So the overall general view is I'm going to look at what is systems, the initial systemic design thinking, and through the discourse, I'm going to have a bit of a discussion about that topic. Point number 2. Then I'm going to talk about what is data and information and knowledge and the wisdom, and why is this important? What has that got to do with anything I'm talking about? And the implementation and the methodology that you might want to apply to do your practice. And big data and datification and design and systems thinking. What does this mean for us in the future? So this is like a general overview of what I'm going to try and sort of cover in this session. But let's first talk about systems and design. And I say systems and design because at this point, I don't want to sort of get into any terminology. I just simply want to talk about systems and design. So what are systems? Systems are not something that you connect. It's not about I put this together and this together, and then I've got 5 of them and I can connect them, and then that's a system. That's possibly a network, that's possibly many other things, but it may not be systemic. You need to be careful when you're trading with systematic and systemic. These are very, very different things. So when we're talking about systems, we're talking about relationships, predominantly relationships and impacts between nodes. So systems and systemic work is really about the relationships, correlations, and things that happen between. So we're very interested in the things you can't see, the things that go on between the points that are communicating. So there are many different things that you could focus on. You could focus on communication. You could focus on neural networks. You could focus on traffic, health. It can be applied to so many things. But fundamentally, it's about the relationships between. The theories are a vast number of theories that you can apply. And there are many definitions, none of which people can conclusively agree. And that's okay, because as we know, it's all right to disagree. You can agree to disagree. Just have a good argument. That's all I say. So be able to explain why you are going the way you are going. So the history of systems and design, that's something also I just want to touch on through discussion. And the key elements and behaviors. This is very important, because if you're going to understand systems and how to interact with design, you need to understand the elements and behaviors on both different types of approaches and how they may come together or how they actually miss each other. So the future directions and the work and design and systems, I want to discuss that at the end and have a discussion about where to go from here. So that's pretty much how I want to discuss and integrate the systems and the design conversation today. So looking at some of the history, I told you I wanted to go through some of the history. Before you say, oh, this is not exactly what I'm thinking, bear with me. Because if you understand where people have come from, it gives you a pretty strong indication of where you, as the new people in design, might want to go. If you don't understand the history of where something has come from, it's very, very difficult to understand where you are right this minute, this second, right here in the present, and where you might want to go in the future. So some history of design and systems, and I'm being very targeted here because of the time, but I'm going to suggest that we select some key people who have had a great deal to say about this in the past. And I've taken a fairly recent academic, Kupats from 2015, who discusses Herbert Simons. And Herbert Simons was around in the 50s and 60s predominantly. Started his career in the 40s post-war, post-Second World War, and actually grew up in the era, well, his working life was in the era post-war, and looking at the different types of approaches of how to do business management. And so he came from originally, and he's actually a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and came from the area of management initially. Some of you may have heard of him. I'm not saying that you haven't. I don't know you as a class, so I'm just going to be very general here and just say that this is a very famous paper. Most of you may have heard of it or not. It's okay. I'm just going to bring it up now because we're going to discuss it. It had a fairly big impact. The paper was the sciences of the artificial, and it was considered one of the things that the design theory people and the people researching design really focused on in the earlier past decades. And so they actually looked at what the definition, because they liked the idea that Herbert Simon had introduced the idea of the definition as a designer in his work. So it's something that people cite all the time. They're always talking about this in many papers, design papers. They talk about the idea that everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. And that is a famous quote, and it's often used as a way to define. And because Herbert Simon was involved in systems, he was predominantly also looking at it because of the management element of his initial work. It was considered quite reductionist in some ways, and I'll explain that. So why is that a problem? Well, because systems is not linear. Number one, systems are not linear. They are multidimensional, right? So if you have a process can be a beginning, a middle, and an end. In business management and in some schools of work, it's a linear process. Engineering actually gets, it gets criticized sometimes from people outside of engineering, that it is very linear. It has a process, it never deviates. And this is because in engineering, and those designers who work in engineering are constrained. They're constrained. They have to work within the regulation of physics, because you don't want a bridge to fall down. You don't want a plane that's flying through the air to fall down. But these are also the same constraints that we are fighting today with a virus. So understand that systemic thinking impacts our lives so much more because of the interconnectivity of the global sphere, how our lives are interconnected. This is something that cannot be denied. So I'm going on to the next slide now, that you can understand where this conversation is going. Why is this beginning? And remember, this is a very famous thing. It's from the 1950s. So previously to that, earlier design method movements defined design as a problem-solving, process-orientated activity, rather primarily concerned with the production and of physical things. So we moved to this. We moved from here to this, but now we move on. So from some design issues that you would like to consider, the much more contemporary design research in pursuit of academic respectability, Simons, he was broadly cited because of the building up of design literature, design research, And so they wanted to actually find a scientific problem-solving focus. So this is why he was widely cited. Except in more recent times, people have become to understand that the repression of the judgment, repressing, not allowing the judgment, the intuition, the experience, the social interaction in Simon's work, some logic of design. It was quite constrained. At the time, it seemed quite vibrant, but in actual fact, it's quite constrained, quite controlled. And you have to understand what the world was doing when Simon wrote those papers. It was post-war, and people were trying to find the logic, how to organize things better. So the crossover of management, economics, systems, and systematic engineering all came together, and this is kind of the area in which Simon was working in at the time. So whilst it was a very good conversation, it's a good quote. This was a good quote. Every designer, who devises courses of action, this is actually a very good thing. It's not actually useful in more recent times because of the fact that the logic of design has to move on with what's going on now, and that's because of data, and I'll get onto that in a minute. So it continues to have profound implications for design and research and practice. Okay, so do understand where the conversation around systems and design came from, where did it grow? And because of this, a lot of people have rejected Simon's work in later years, in decades, and are focusing in a different direction. Many American design theorists, historians, and design researchers use Dewey as a counterpoint to Simon's work. So some design issues, systems engineering, the management of design and the development of technological systems have come into play. If you think about what's happened in the last 50 years, it's a really big leap forward. So there are many different ways in which you can look at the different development of systems. So I'm talking about systems now, and then I'll bring in design, and then we'll have the conversation about how they come together. So the comparison of systems, the many different types of solutions on board, the systems dynamics, the development of comparative system models that are used in policy making. So there's so many. That's just, you don't need to look deeply into this slide. It's just for me to explain to you how many, how prolific the different directions of systems and systems analysis have gone into in the last 50 years. And this has had a huge impact. What does design do in order to be a part of that conversation? How is design engaging with that conversation? These are the things that I would like to bring up now. This is important because it actually impacts your practice and your thinking. Policy making, for example, those people who are in design policy or policy for design, there are many different elements of this area. Design has a big role to play, but it also needs to understand the dance between different disciplines and the multidisciplinarity, and how that actually comes together to enhance the design focus and direction and how it engages with other elements to actually make it more viable and more more impactful. So how the initial attempts by designers and engineers and architects, such as Alexander, very famous, for those of you who don't know, I suggest you look it up, during the 1960s, the scientific design methods. These were all attempts during the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s and beyond, looking at the scientific design methods, and largely were ignored by Simon in later years. Even though he was so influential and so quoted, now in these later years, he really, after 1960s, he just stopped talking about design and design methods after that time. So design methods movements already noted in the limitations, had already noted all of those limitations in solving design problems, because it was too reductionist ultimately. Very logical. It was in alignment with engineering, and this is something you need to understand. Because of this impact, because people had already looked at Simon's and gone into a different direction, design started to feel a little uneasy perhaps about systems and how this worked. So there is a bit of history behind this. So about the same time, Rittel, now some of you might know about the wicked problem conversation. I'm assuming some of you know about the wicked problem. So this was this is a definition and a discussion that came up around the same time. And they proposed an alternative model, which was design process based on wicked problems. And this contrasted the science, which were sort of tamed, as in like, I give you something static and we work on it and then we solve it and we have a goal orientation and we finish that. So this is actually what is sort of countering that idea and planning of social problems. And those of you who understand Peter Jones's work from OCAD University, 0.1234, Design 03, Design 4, 1 being products, 2 being services, 3 organizations, and 4 society. This is actually something that goes very well with that concept. And the idea is that the wicked, they argued the wicked was rely upon judgment for resolution, political judgment for resolution. That's what they were arguing, Rittel and Weber. And the idea is that it's contrary to Simon's military systems approach, because Simon actually was researching during the development of the military complex system that was coming up at the time in the 50s. And the problems, and I've highlighted it here for you to just look at, that the problem ultimately resolved rather than solved. So here we kind of have the first sort of little branching off that we can't always resolve, we can't solve everything. And in design, in certain areas of design, problem solving is very strong. So I'm trying to put the little seeds and little breadcrumbs for you to follow that, in fact, where do we go when we start asking questions about problem solving versus resolution, or actually remaining unsolved because we can't solve them because they're wicked. Or there are other definitions to wicked, and now we begin to see other aspects. So acknowledging the social foundations of any design process, they called it the understanding of designing for an argumentative process. So this also means at this point that process is not just a beginning, a middle, and end. Processes can be embedded, linear processes can be embedded in systems which are dynamic, and that dictates a whole new relationship. So remember at the beginning I said that systems are all about relationships and correlations. So these are elements that Rittel wanted to explain about the wicked problem approach and that understanding of designing. So I think this is quite an interesting sort of statement, that it's the understanding of designing as an argumentative process. So a way to argue a process, to move forward, but perhaps not ultimately solve it, but somehow resolve it for the time being. And maybe that's an ongoing thing, and that's why it's wicked. So some design issues to consider in terms of the design research world, an entirely different perspective on Simon's science of design. This is what happened. It emerged, a completely different perspective. Some other direction happened. And so one in which the sciences of the artificial was received quite differently. So this is where I'm just another breadcrumb for you to follow, that it's going in a different direction. And why did the relationship between systems and design, why do we have that relationship we have today, and what does that mean? So the issues of ethics is critical here. We need to understand that interestingly, the user-centric design, particularly participatory design and other variations on co-design, since Simon's sciences on the artificial, has absolutely shown us that there's a shift away from his technocratical design approach. And because of this, it's an acknowledgement of the design ethical foundation has been growing. So here is another few breadcrumbs, and this actually goes in a different direction. Okay, so it's going in a different direction. So we can see that we're growing in a way that perhaps is not sort of core central to design thinking, but it's actually it's augmenting, it's actually enhancing it, but it's in a different direction. And interestingly enough, you have design theorists such as Clive Dilnot and Tony Fry, and they've recently extended this ethical foundation to include relations between design and clients and stakeholders. So now we actually start seeing the development of the relationship between. And this is some time after. So understanding the sustainability, or as I like to say, the ability to sustain. Sustainability is about the ability. What is your ability to sustain? And embodied in the practices and things. So how do you sustain? What are the abilities? What is the understanding? What do you need to understand how to sustain something? What are those abilities? So this is actually very important in terms of the relationship between design and client and stakeholders. So this is what has been discussed in more recent decades. So another breadcrumb for you to follow. So, and here we can't escape it. We can't escape the sort of understanding and the discussions and the critiques that have gone on around Simon's science of design. Such an important start and it's still used as a foundation. So why do we still use those definitions of Simon's science of design? Because the issue remains when you're devising courses of actions aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. That's the actual quote. The point is, who determines this? Who determines the course of action? Whose preferred situations are we designing for? And that's a very interesting question. For systems and design, or if you like, design and systems, it doesn't really matter which way, because and in the middle. So they're equally engaging. So who is actually the one who determines the course of action? Who are the people who we're designing for? What exactly are we designing? What is the situation? Now, here's the interesting thing about systems and design. It says here that we're looking at situations, not necessarily people. So if we are looking at systemic design conversations, as in like Oslo, Berger from Oslo and Peter Jones from OCAD in Canada, they have founded systemic design, and this is very important. The conversations that come up in systemic design now are actually based on a lot of questions around, or the engagement around, courses of action and who are the preferred situations and who are we designing for. So the question is, when you're looking at design 0.3 to 4, which is organization and society, we are looking at people and also the context of people. Now, context becomes a really important issue if we're going to discuss preferred situations, not people, preferred situations, and who and we, and are we designing, what are we designing? So is it just courses of action and preferred situations? Now, there's an interesting point here. Do we imply that people are always involved in situations and courses of action? Are people always involved? Is it always anthropomorphically based? So these are current questions, which I'm not going to attempt to answer, but I'm simply bringing this up in terms of new directions for systemic thinking and design and systems. So if we have gone through a very, very quick snapshot of history there, and we come to the point now that we have understood that in actual fact, the actions and courses, we need to understand what we're doing in the future and how these relationships impact. So what is it that we're supposed to be designing for, or who or what? Interesting question. So I'm just going to leave that there with you to think about as we go to the next slide. So systemic design, as I've already kind of touched on, is the co-evolving fields of joining of design-led systemics, referred to as systemic design, and it should be distinguished. You shouldn't put them in the same box as engineering, hard sciences, epistemologies, or systems design or systems engineering, although they borrow from each other, and because none, unless you're a pure mathematician or maybe someone working in physics, and not even physics these days, everybody is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, intradisciplinary. We are all in some way engaging with other disciplines. And we need to understand how to do that better. And it's not an easy task, because there are many things that you need to take in consideration. As a designer, someone who's looking at design, what elements of systems, okay, that's a big question, do I engage with? First of all, perhaps you want to define what you mean by systems. Fundamental point number one, what do you mean by systems? What do you understand by systems? Are you referring to a systemic? Are you talking about it as systematic? That's a completely different thing. Okay. Not to say that systematic is less important. It isn't. It has its place. Like every other discipline, they all have their place. How do you want to engage with it as a designer? If you're even doing practice, if you're pure practice, I've had conversations with students and people who say, but I'm just a practitioner, I don't really need to know all. You need to understand the world you live in. That's my argument. You may not need the depth of scientific rigor, but you may want to understand the world you live in. And because we are interconnected, understanding the basic fundamentals of systems, regardless of what you do, is probably a good step. So systemic, which is a movement in design, is looking at design-led systemics, and the systemic design is quite different from what you would say in hard sciences or engineering, because in engineering they also have systems engineering, soft systems engineering. This doesn't mean that you can't comprehend how to use certain elements and crossover. As I said to you, my undergraduate was in arts and preservation, cultural heritage. And I did the arts and management and then engineering. So these crossovers are very important if you're doing work with design, because I believe design has a lot to offer in terms of how things run, how well things coordinate. And this is, of course, a lot of the work. I'm involved in the systemic design movement. And it's interesting the work that they're trying to do through the integrated practices and systems and services. Peter Jones, these are some of the names here in the new book that has come out about that. So this is actually a very interesting direction. So I'm putting this in here just to show you another element of systems and design and how that's come together, and the conversations and the work that has been done. Peter Jones, for example, has done a lot. He's not traditionally in his background, he's not a traditional design background, but he works in OCAD in the design school there, and he has been working on working with government, so governance, so systemic governance, and looking at relationships and health. So he does a lot of work with health organizations, hospitals, those sorts of things. So and improving and bringing design thinking to the way in which those systemic aspects work, and how to do engagement and how to produce that work. So you need a lot of background to build up that expertise, but it's an exciting area for anybody who wants to work to develop new 21st century skill sets about how to approach a system, how to do that work, what are the elements, the feeling of walking into an organization on Monday morning and saying, okay, what do I do? How do I talk to a client? How do I talk to the organization? How do I start the idea about problem solving? Or am I aiming for problem resolution because of the relationships and the complexity involved? So this is actually something that you may be interested as designers, because part of this session I'm having with you is trying to wake you up and open your eyes to the possibilities that you might be able to engage between systems and design, of what's actually already happening and has been for the last 10, 20 years. So adaptive systems is something I work heavily in and have been for a long time, and is now beginning to have its day, I think, because of the way in which the interconnectivity. Adaptive systems comes from hard sciences, but the work I've been doing within design field for the last 10 years has shown there are different ways that you can approach it, and it's actually in some ways quite rigorous without being overbearing. And so you have the opportunity to have engagement about design approaches and systemic thinking because of its adaptive nature. I'm going to talk about, we talked about systemic design here, but now I'm going to talk about adaptive systems. Complex adaptive systems are quite different. They're in a little class of their own. They behave different. They have different elements about them. Systemic design is a co-evolving design-led movement. It is people-centric. So it has the elements of human-centric or people-centric or design. This is part of the element of it. Adaptive systems is one step further. It sort of takes it back to the definition of the question asked here. You know, who determines the course of action? The course of action and preferred situations, not necessarily people, right? So adaptive systems, complex adaptive systems, are looking at an approach that may or may not actually involve people, but have an impact on people. COVID-19 is a very good analogy. We are in the world of interconnectivity, and the actions of one can have an impact on the many. Complex adaptive systems are not judgmental. They don't have compassion, and they don't lack compassion. It's just not an element. It is striving to live, and it's striving to survive, as in life, because complex adaptive systems are based on biological living. So life always tries to find the best way forward to live, to survive, to avoid entropy. So adaptive systems, it's quite a powerful impact when you have design thinking and complex adaptive systems joined together, because this is linking people, nature, and socio-ecological systems. It's increasingly understood as a complex adaptive system. So it's non-linear feedbacks. And I said to you that relationships are critical. What if our survival and designing better 0.4, and I'm going to argue that this is 0.5, as Peter Jones has pointed out. I'll bring that up in the next slides coming, that it's societal and it has another element, because society is a complex adaptive system. Society and the planet we live on, because humans don't live in a vacuum. We live in cities. Cities are in nature. Nature has an environment, you know, so we have many layers. So systems also have layers. So the feedback and the interactions of individuals and scales are very important. And the varying time scales are very important. We are learning, we're having an all crash course on time scales. The virus is all about time scales, because we are looking at a living organism which needs us in order to have its sustained life. So if you want to focus on what is actually going on, a complex adaptive system will give you the key elements of it so that you understand the relationships better. If you're going to be a designer, this might be very important. How is this related to design? Well, let me give you an example. Dyson had to come up with a ventilator, which actually had to come up with various different elements they were trying to solve. Understanding the feedback and the strategic interactions of the virus as a living organism actually gives you a better understanding through adaptive systems, how to design something that actually requires a certain time scale approach. So these are some examples, perhaps, why an adaptive system or understanding adaptive systems is quite critical for the 21st century people's mindsets, and also 21st century skill sets that we need to adapt in order to continue the work that we're doing. So it's kind of counterproductive. It's not really very helpful to continue to ignore complex adaptive systems. It's kind of difficult to do that. Design has had a history of working with systems, but my argument in the coming this year and working with other colleagues is to actually push that a little bit further and say, let's be a bit more proactive about complex adaptive systems and design, and working with the work that has already been done in systemic design, and moving even further into the adaptive systems approach, so that we can start to work towards complex adaptive systems as opposed to just kind of ignoring them, because they are in a special category. They do behave differently to other systems. The social ecological systems are very new. Very new. Not a lot has been done by these social ecological systems. So what does this mean? Well, for example, as I said to you, it's not necessarily, you know, people, but what the preferred situations are. So we're looking here, for example, coral reefs, grasslands, implications of economics, and policy analysis. Now, design has already had quite a big impact in all of those areas. You can't say, I can find examples where design has had an impact in all of those areas and has engaged, it's certainly engaged in all of those areas. There's work, projects, practices, research that design has engaged with various different areas of these examples here, posted by Levin in 2012. So my point is that we need to keep pushing forward to understand social complex adaptive systems, or in Levin put it here as a social ecological system, because we need to understand how these processes came up. If I come back to the obvious one, the elephant in the room, as I might like to say, that we're all talking to each other. Technology is wonderful. We're talking to each other, having a class here, but COVID-19, its origins may have been through the way in which we handle animals, as how humanity actually has handled animals, how we deal with all of these issues. Perhaps we need to start looking at the social ecological system network and understanding that better, and actually designing different approaches and practices. But from a design point of view, the traditional design point of view, people would argue, or however you want to approach that, if you're an industrial designer, there are so many different ways that design as a discipline could respond and engage and have a conversation with the social ecological systems that now impact us so heavily. So that kind of brings me to the building blocks for adaptive systems. And there are so many building blocks for adaptive systems. I mean, the social, it started quite some time ago, back in 2000, from economics and management, but also John Seely Brown, actually, it's a good book. And there's a new version out now, The Social Life of Information. How do we start understanding? How do we begin to comprehend what I've just been talking about? That's all very well for me to use these social complex adaptive systems and social ecological systems, and these are all great terms, but where does a person doing a master's first year start to begin to understand where to look, how to do it? What are the key elements? What are the key words? How do you begin this process? So I always like to start with the obvious because I think that's a good place to start at the beginning, I guess. But what exactly, I want to ask the question, and if we were in a classroom together, I could see you and I could ask the question. But one of the questions I'd like for you to think about there as you're sitting in front of your computer, what exactly are we talking about? So are we talking about data, information, and knowledge? And what are these things? I like to look at these in terms of social complex adaptive systems, or adaptive systems, or CAS as some people call them. I like to look at these as living things. data and information knowledge are certainly living things. And why is that the case? Why do I say that they're living things? Some people might say that's nonsense. Data doesn't live, and information, I can get it from a book. It's So no, I would argue that in the 21st century, we certainly have changed the paradigm on data, information, knowledge, and they have become living things. And I will explain it now in this next section. So context is king or queen or important. I like context. Context is critical, because without context, we really don't understand systems and we don't understand relationships. Without context or anchoring your research work or your master's thesis or whatever the work is that you're doing as a designer, context is asking the question about where your problem solving or your goal orientated or even very basic thing that you want to design, where does it live? Where is it living? So it's no different, for example, if you're an industrial designer and you're designing a ventilator with Dyson. You don't design it and say, well, I just want to design this fantastic thing and then, and then I'll give it to you. No, it has to have a context. It has an environment in which it lives. This is something that you should probably stick on your wall in front of you and have every day. Context, what is your context of your question, context of your approach, context of your methodology, context of the relationships that you're discussing, all of those things, because context is the environment, the thing that keeps your work real and grounded. Without context, it's pretty hard to understand what you're talking about. So that's really important, especially in systems. And the digital age has changed our perceptions and our practices. After 2016, and the years past now, we cannot go back. It's done. The horse has bolted. It's out, and the impact of digitization on our lives is profound. And it will have an impact, and it does and continues to have an impact. And artificial intelligence, or augmented intelligence, as I like to call it, these are really interesting impacts. And some people are quite fearful, quite rightly so. However, like anything, you need to understand what it is that you're approaching. What is the context? So when you start talking about systems, the best thing that you can do for yourself is to understand the context in which you are asking the question, designing, applying, anything in terms of design and systems. Understand the context. So this is important. And if I run a whole course on systems and impact and designing those kinds of questions and practice. And we work together, and it takes practice. Just like anything, you actually have to practice it, believe it or not. I'm sure that those of you who are doing projects right now understand that you have to practice it. You have to put it into action. So what was then? What was in the past? Well, with systems in mind, where to from here? So I wanted to ask, we had in the past, we've had data and knowledge, what happened, application of experience, the landscape of information, discussion, process, analysis. Okay, that's good. But where to from here? Where do we go from here? What was the past? So I've already said to you that knowledge, I think that knowledge and data to knowledge has a particular way in which it occurs. So in the context of what was in the past, I'm going to go to the next slide. Sorry. data to knowledge. And how do we get there? It's just not information. It's just not. Information is many things, but it's not just information. Application of experience and environment to information in order to achieve results. You know, you see you have policy and process, discussion and conversation and analysis. So how do you understand it? So my question to you is, what do you imagine data and knowledge is? What do you imagine it is? Application of experience. So what I'm saying is that knowledge is an application of experience and environment to information, and there's a result and the way in which it works. So let me explain. So in a case study, knowledge in action. So knowledge is action. Okay, knowledge is experience. So that's interesting. So data is something that you get from, say, a statement from the bank, and you have a lot of numbers, or it's something. Data is everywhere, by the way. So we start with data, then we get the information, and then we do something. So, for example, here's a personal knowledge, here's a project knowledge, and this is just to show you all the different types of relationships in between. So understand the difference between knowledge and information. What exactly are we trying to manage? So yeah, it's a good question. What are you trying to manage? So if you're a designer, you need to understand what the knowledge is. You need to understand the information. Do not interchange them. They are not interchangeable. Knowledge and information are absolutely not the same thing. When you're designing things, you might, and thinking of design thinking and an approach, you might sort of take a technological push, capture the record knowledge. You might actually capture it. This might be a good way to go forward, but it leads to information sharing rather than knowledge sharing. What do I mean by that? That's actually quite an important question, because if I'm trying to solve a problem and I want to design a solution, and it's in a systemic approach. So I'm trying to work out an organizational issue. I'm trying to work out a societal issue. And I have a goal, and I want to solve this problem. But as we discovered with Rittel, as we discussed earlier, that it's not so good to try to find a way to just solve the solution. Perhaps I can only resolve it because it's wicked. It's got too many complexities involved. One of the things that you can do to help yourself move forward is to actually understand knowledge sharing as opposed to information sharing. What do I mean by that? What's information sharing as opposed to knowledge sharing? Well, knowledge is action, right? So understand the difference of data and information. So let's go backwards. I'm going backwards now. So let's begin at the beginning here. So data is a set of values that have a qualitative and quantitative variables. That's the definition of data, right? So an example of qualitative is handwritten notes, interviews, community members, and data is an individual pieces of information. And then you use that and you create information. So you write a book, you might put a slideshow together, you might do a video. That's all information, right? So that's all data. There's all different types of data, you know. I've just used symbols here. So data is everywhere. Data is everywhere. So the different types of data, and it can be measured, reported, it can be collected, analyzed. These are all the things that you would do if you were doing a design solution for a big corporation, organization, for a government, perhaps, hospital, traffic solution, problem solving for pollution. I mean, these are just a few of the things. So the action can be applied to both quantitative and qualitative data. So typically, data that's quantitative is if it's not it's numerical, and qualitative is not. That's pretty the basics there. Why do I talk about this? Because if you're doing the building blocks and you want to understand the systems, you need to understand what the system is doing. So they're the fundamentals. So how did these different data approaches impact one another? So they have an impact about the different ways that you produce something, qualitative, quantitative. You'll need all of these elements in order to understand perhaps what you're building up to. If you don't understand this, it's very difficult to understand the basics of systems approach, because it is about how you play with data, information to produce knowledge. So this is actually a really critical part. So some of the arguments about quantitative, it's rigorous, it's credible, it's scientific. Now, this goes back to the conversation I had with you about Simon's. Simon's quotes have been used for decades because design researchers and theorists used it because they considered it hard, rigorous, credible, and scientific. But at the same time, Rittel was putting forward the alternative, which was wicked problems, right? And they were saying sensitive, nuanced, details, and contextual. So here we have the word contextual, which is super important, right? So we need to understand how we're actually approaching something. So a unit analysis is just about what it is that we're going to use in order to do that work. So what is it that we're doing that work for? How do we approach that? And statistically, that's statistics. You understand statistics. That's just number crunching. I won't go into that too much. But the comparisons are important. So you need to understand. Now, here's something very important. So knowledge is not just why and what. Knowledge is a living thing. And this is actually quite important for your systems work, if you're going to work with design and systems and how to produce a project. So the new world order and the new mindset, it's you don't just collect data and information, it requires a whole new mindset. And this is the one that's very interesting. The quantitative change has led to a qualitative one. So it means that data actually has meant a big change in the way in which we understand how we handle information, data, and knowledge, okay? So this is where it gets very interesting in terms of the impact. So the spread of data, the change began with the sciences of astronomy. So big data has impacted us hugely and will continue to do so. As designers going into the 21st century, you're going to have to understand what big data is. You need to understand the components of big data. You need to understand how that works and why is that impactful for systems and design. If you're working with organizations, if you're working with any service systems, anything like that, that's actually going to be a huge impact for the future in terms of mindset. So big data moved from the sciences and human activities during the 2000s. So that's actually, it started in astronomy because of the number crunching processes. So the definitions for this is, there's no specific definition for big data at the moment. It's sort of agreed that if the engineers need to have multiple data sets to get an answer, that's considered big data. It's not really clear. It doesn't have a clear definition. So in other words, things that one can analyze on a large scale. That's about as specific as they get. They don't get any more specific than that in terms of, there are different types, but it's one of those areas that no one can agree on. So the question of more, messy, and good is good enough. So big data in terms of, and big data is a big question and very important when you're looking at systems. So as a designer, you need to understand the basics of, say, how systems function, what do they do. And so I'm trying to just quickly go over the building blocks that you might be you may have not have considered as part of understanding systems. You might have thought, well, that's not relevant. It actually is. It's actually really important. So I'm just highlighting for you those things that are actually quite maybe obvious, but you need to put them, I'm putting them into context for you so that you understand why they're obvious. And the reason why design and systems can be so impactful is because often systems and design, or design and systems, can tell you, design on its own can tell you what is going on and how it happened, but it might not be, without the interaction with other disciplines and other perspectives, it might not be able to tell you why. So part of the beauty of actually looking at, say, for example, systemic design and the work that Peter Jones does in very large medical facilities, is that he can tell you the work that they do, it points to why something operates the way it does. It means that there's an opportunity in correlating between systemic and design to understand why something keeps occurring or why it doesn't. You have some feedback loop. So, but part of why you do that is about data and information and knowledge. And so because big data is now with us and we can't get away from it, since 2016, that's it. If you are doing work with organizations and society and you don't have a good handle on what impact the data, information, knowledge, and big data is doing, the chances is that your work is probably falling short, because big data has a particular way of operating. So big data is actually not precise in by itself. It gets its precision by doing comparisons, millions of them, and it's very messy. It's not good quality, but the way in which it does it over a period of time, it can actually tell you fairly precisely and show up new trends. This is called emergent. So the outcomes are quite emergent. They're not actually targeted, hard, and precise. That's not what big data is. And so the data sets are very, very large to actually achieve this. So precise data set would be something like how much money is in your wallet. You know exactly. There's no question that you look at it and you see it and it's very precise. That's a precise thing. A big data is a huge, huge comparison, and you get a trend over a period of time. So the messiness in action is actually quite important. So the relationships and the nature of those relationships and what does it look like in action. Now we get into it. Now you begin to understand the impact of what design and systems might look like when you're looking at the fundamentals of how that might actually behave. So there's a lot of behavior elements. There are behavioral elements, like what is the relationship. So when you start talking to design, large data set analysis people and people who work, they often talk about the data like it's a person. So often the data can have like personalities, so this is actually, as human beings, we love to make everything anthropomorphic. We love to put everything in our own image. We like to see things from a human point of view. And systems offers a way that might give you an answer or resolve something for you. Maybe not a solution, but it might resolve something for you for the next step by giving you a different perspective. So this is why it's kind of the adaptive systems can be quite magical in the way in which they can sort of unearth or show up or expose certain elements that may not have been obvious before. So this is why messiness in action is kind of like interesting. This is just an example. You know, when you go to a social media and you have likes, they might have a specific number, but when you have so many, they might just sort of say K for thousands. So the symbols start, you understand there's a lot of likes, but you don't, the number doesn't mean anything anymore. So it's correlations is what I'm talking about. So here we are, correlations. And these are about adding predictions or associations. Actually, it's better to call correlations associations because it's really not about predicting. Because honestly, whatever data sets you have, it'll tell you the associations. It may be completely wrong because it was designed that way. So better not to say predictive correlations, better to sort of say associations. It's a better way of sort of discussing that. But that's a whole class in of itself. But anyway, that's something that you need to consider. So predictions and correlations or associations are very important. In the field of big data, they always talk about predictions and correlations as the terms that they use. So strong correlations, weak correlations, these are the fundamental building blocks and tools that you need if you really wanted to look at building a really good relationship or a really good systemic design or approach or solution for a project or a problem that you have. So poor data from bad governance. This is something I just want to touch on because I've got not so much time left, but I just want to touch on this. Poor governance. Poor data from bad governance. So this is exactly what I was talking about before in terms of correlation. So if you don't have, uncovering insights more clearly than before, but remember folks, whatever you're doing here, if you haven't been clear about the questions and the context and how you framed it in the first place, you might get the right answer, but it's the wrong question. So just think about that. And you can't get away from thinking about this because of the world we live in. This is your responsibility. Your responsibility as designers to be responsible in the way in which you approach things. And data is, whilst very exciting and can produce amazing things, can also give you a type 4 response, meaning type 4 is a kind of systems term, which means that you ask the question, you get the right answer, but it's the wrong direction. Okay, so you actually have the right answer for the wrong question. So this is a little, just touching very briefly on relationships between designing and practicing, between systems and design is the poor data from bad governance. So if you don't have the good governance, can lead to unreliable conclusions. Your outcomes might be absolutely correct and it seems perfect and it's following everything, but that's because your data is poor in the first place. So something to be considered because of the world in which we live. Very important. Understand how to where your data originated, how was it handled, what were the goals when it was set up, and then I'll just touch very briefly here about AI platforms, augmented intelligence, artificial intelligence, machine learning models, and what they set out to achieve, if in fact that's the kind of data that you collected. Recently, my PhD class actually designed a wonderful questionnaire And they were so happy. They were doing, let me just have a look, they were doing community and population. Community and population in relation to the education and health question. And they were looking at community and population. And the designers set out to actually ask a question, and the correlation of that question was health in relation to community and population, and how many people had to be online. And so they were doing something that was directly related to the COVID-19 question. They felt that was important. But they got 600 responses, which seemed fantastic for them. They were super happy. When they started doing the analysis and going through the process, they realized that in fact it was an AI response, which meant that the information was very skewed. It said that there were things like that people didn't, more than 400 people didn't care about health in relation to one of the questions, which was completely strange. And so there were indicators for them to realize that the response, whilst wonderful and they got many responses, the response wasn't human. So these are some of the questions that you might come up with now. This is actually real and happens. So how to handle that is actually really important. And AI and all of this is this whole slide is like basically another class. But anyway, so I just wanted to touch on that. So, so datification. So datification is something that you really need to understand as well if you're looking at systems and design, especially adaptive systems. And data, and if you're looking at systemic design, they talk about data a lot. It's a Latin-based to be known or to show to be known. That is actually data. So the technologists have this implicit belief that big data came from Silicon Revolution and it's a technological thing. Not so much. Data is not that. Yes, if you're in a modern context, you might sort of argue that. But I just wanted to, in the last minutes that we've got here, I just wanted to explain to you what sort of the depth and breadth of data. I've talked about data, big data. I've touched on all the things that are impacting us in the 21st century, yes. But I do want to give you a little bit of depth in the historic process. Datification, the last word on technology. I really like this concept. Matthew Fontaine Marie in 1839 developed multiple sources of data, including conversations, maps, drawings. So you might have said that that's quantitative and qualitative. So it was a mix. The physical geography of the sea. It was for the work, the physical geography of the sea. And this paved the way. This work was very important. It paved the way for the transatlantic telegraphic cable. There you go. So without computers, the data, when datification is applied well, the outcome was the laying down of the transatlantic telegraphic cable. So it was quite doable without computer datification. So you can do what I call these days datification, analog datification. You can do as a designer. It's very important that this is actually important for design in terms of there are different ways that design thinking can be applied to actually enhance this kind of analog type of datification to bring together and have meaningful sets of data. So whilst it's not based on the classical sense of technological approach, it's still a big data approach because it's an analog version of big data. The data sets, I mean, I looked into it, the data sets that he produced were huge. And they were varied. And they do actually sit into the classification of datafication in terms of a big data approach, but not the technological side. So it's an analog technology, if you like. So this is just to remind people that it's not just about computers and technologies and science and AI and all of that. You can actually be very hands-on and very earthy about what you want to do. It really relies on your imagination. Okay, so that's really important. So what's next? Good question. What is next? Here we are, April 2020. Well, this is a year we're all going to remember. I never thought that I would be doing a webinar for you in India at this time, so I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to do that. But what are the points? The new possibilities for developing new links between the design, human-based, human-centric design approaches and the elements of the adaptive systems. There were so many things that we could do. We have had historic processes that have perhaps led us away and maybe split design and systems. I'm sort of advocating that, in fact, we should embrace the new types of approaches that are out there. We should embrace new ways of theorizing and practicing and putting together systems and design in a systemic manner, and perhaps exploring something beyond the human-centric. So the new generations that are coming up will probably have no trouble with this. And so what sort of elements and approaches can be developed and built between adaptive systems and design approaches? This is the question I'm just going to leave up there for you to think about. And looking at design for organizations and societies is necessary, and we need to explore the different approaches that might exist between the edges of multiple disciplines to resolve, as Riddle said, and practice systemic design and approaches from complex adaptive systems to frame new directions and try and explore new relationships and engagement and practice and theories between the adaptive systems and design. So that's it from me, people. I've had fun talking to you today. I hope that was of value to you. I hope that was interesting. It's not a traditional design lecture for sure, but then systems and design is not a traditional area. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I thought I'd make an observation that the systems approach should ideally be taught very early during the course of design. Primarily because at a time like this, when we have reached this unprecedented state we are in, we realize that because we have ignored the systems approach, that we are in a state like what we are in. We little details all around, which has brought us to this state. And now when everything is broken down around us, we see these pathways connecting seemingly unconnected things. And we know that we have reached this kind of a situation. Systems design approach probably should be the basis for almost all design. Right now, we design those small parts and then leading to more and more complex things. But one should realize it's the complex things which are absolutely important. We should see the whole picture. Yeah, parts are important too.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. I mean, I've been involved, I think my first position in design school it was RMIT, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, with Mark Barry in this SILE living the lab. That was back in 2008. And it was interesting then. I mean, it's been a struggle, I have to say, to be involved in systems and design. I've since started talking about systems and design because I just don't want to get into the whole conversation about systemic systems and all of this, but just to try to highlight that there needs to be a relationship, or a better relationship, I would say. And thank you for bringing that up. I think it actually needs to be very early on, so that people can choose what directions they want to go in, but be at least informed that these are there. If people sort of say, I want nothing to do with systems, that's okay. But I think as an educational institution that we all engaged in, I think it's kind of like important that we give people the opportunity and allow them the choices that are available, and highlight those things so that people can make valid choices for themselves, how they want to conduct their research and what directions they want to go in. There are, as you know, there's so many different schools, design schools, and they all have their own elements and how they are. I have to say, for systems people, they're very open. Systems people are generally fairly open and pretty friendly lot. They love people asking questions and getting involved, and they love to help you find directions. I mean, I've been involved with that community for a long time, and also the interdisciplinary group that cross over that. Because if you don't share, there are no solutions, you know. There's no, you've got to share. It's all integrated. And I guess systems people don't, perhaps they're a little bit less judgmental, because if you don't know, then it's okay to ask, because there's so many perspectives that are possible. So the only way to know is to discuss. So this is kind of like an element that I'd like to, as you so kindly, you know, brought up about systems, I'd really like to instill that kind of generosity of spirit, I guess, about inquiry and asking questions and getting curious about your life, your research, your work, your practice, you know. So as you said, we have problems to solve, and we're not going to do it by ourselves. We have to actually share. So yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions? Any brave people out there who want to ask a question?
Thank you, Dr. Nousala. I think Dr. Naveen had a question. That's right. Naveen sir, are you there? Are you there?
No, he just left. He had to go elsewhere. But you can ask.
Yeah, I'll ask it on Naveen's behalf. So, Professor, can we have your views on the positive and the negative feedbacks on agents in CAS? Example of CAS in design context would be highly appreciated.
Wow. Okay. CAS. CAS is actually okay. Understand that complex adaptive systems, or CAS as they're known, actually get very, very technical. They get into the really hardcore sciences. They come from hardcore sciences, actually. Complex ecology is one, for example. I was talking to a very renowned professor, Timothy Allen. Timothy Allen is very elderly now, but he wrote the book on complex ecology. There's a lot of algorithms, there's a lot of science and mathematics involved in some of the complex ecologies. So, okay, so one of the things that we need to sort of develop for ourselves is to understand well, without watering down complex ecology elements, and apply them in a meaningful way to the design aspects. Breaks down is because, rightly so, design says, I'm not a complex ecologist, I can't do this, this is too difficult. But that's it, that's where we need to find commonality, a point of crossover commonality, where we can actually respect the different approaches and bring them together. So this is something that we need to work on, actually. And so, for example, a good example would be the work that Peter Jones has done. I keep citing him because he's involved in that movement, a systemic design, and how he has brought together the complexities of an organization like a medical facility, a hospital, and all the elements, and apply those CAS principles because he has the background. So I think one of the things that you might be sort of alluding to is the interdisciplinarity that we need to develop, but there needs to be a really nice built around that. You don't just throw a whole lot of people together. Okay, well, good luck. You know, we hope you find something. Might be better. A very good one in terms of specific work in the field. For example, the areas of food production, food resilience, smart farming. There's a lot of work done in Spain, for example. There's my group, my team, who are actually some of them based in Spain right now, working on community resilience and food. They're connected. We're not talking community resilience and food. No, they're all connected. It's totally integrated. And so we talk about robotics, but not in the way that robots do the work. We ask the robots to analyze and do the analysis in a large data set so that we can understand what the meaningful directions are. So we're not relying on AI to take over our work. No, it's actually an integrated part of it. So there are movements. And by the way, here's a negative point, but it's an interesting because it could be a positive. AI has gone in a particular direction. That was not the only direction. AI also had foundations in Bateson. There's a philosophy of Bateson AI that actually is quite different from the AI that's been presented in terms of, in some people's view, control. So there are certainly avenues that we could pursue and explore that don't take us all down the same road. It's just that we don't ask the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Nousala. I think a student, Atika from the Department of Visual Communication, final year, wanted to interrupt. Atika, all yours.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you so much for sharing your views today. So there is something I have been struggling with, and I wanted to ask you about it. So there is a certain system that has been followed from a lot of years, and people's brains get acquainted to that system. Right now, because of COVID-19, this system is breaking and changing, and a new change, something new is coming up. So how difficult, like, what do you think? Is it something better? Is it something different? I mean, how is it, changing? Like, yeah.
Yeah, I understand the confusion. Yeah, it's okay. In terms of the virus, there's multiple, again, it comes down to, okay, back up. Because I'm actually involved with it, I know a lot of virologists, I know a lot of complex ecologists and biologists and people like this, okay? Also specific people in engineering, systems engineering or social engineering, not social engineering, systems engineering. Those people all have a particular way of perception of looking at things. What systems thinking gives you is the way in which you can go across a range of people and find the common thread that actually you're wanting to focus on.
Yeah.
So for COVID-19, there's lots of different points of view, but this is, I understand what you're getting at. The system approach seems chaotic. To
Yeah.
someone who hasn't got the system eye or the system thinking, it seems chaos, right? Like how I explained to you, oh, I did arts in the beginning, and then I did design, not design, business and community and knowledge management. Oh, and then I went to engineering. It seems strange, right? But no, there's a common thread all the way through. There's the way in which I apply the knowledge. It's a knowledge network, tacit knowledge networking. It's a common thread. There is a common thread to all of it. And when you actually understand the basic fundamentals of systems and you begin to think as a systems thinker, it's easier for you to understand what you're looking at. You start to analyze the data in a different way. You kind of look at it and go, oh, these are the correlations. So I'm going back to answer your question as precisely as I can at this point. I'd love to sit down with you for an hour and go through it with you. I'd love to do that. But just to briefly sort of say, it's about correlations again. It's about relationships. So what systems does is, it gets accused, designers accuse it of being cold and inhumane and, like having no emotion. That's not the point. To actually save the problem, to save and get the thing, you need to actually look at it and take yourself out of it. It's kind of like, to be a good systems person, have less ego and you'll get there sooner. Take yourself out and have a look. Obviously you can't, because you're an observer, and there's a whole mind body 100-year-old conversations about that. But I'm just sort of saying that in terms of looking at the data, you look at it with the view of what the system is telling you. Are the parameters that you put in correct? We don't know. However, if I do that enough times, I'm going to get something that comes back as a feedback loop, keeps coming again and again and again. And then eventually I'm going, I now have 200 correlations that say X and 10 correlations that say Y. I guess X is the answer for now. Because the best thing you can say in systems is, and that helps you design. It really does help you understand what your design directions might be. And I say for now, because it's a never-ending story. And one of the wonderful things I do from mindset, I have designed a mindset course, which I did for 4 years at Alpha University. And people used to get really angry in the first few weeks, and then at the end they'd go, and then there'd be an aha moment at the end. One of the things about it is that you just never, you need to let it bubble, and then it'll emerge. It's a process of learning. So it's a mindset. It's like giving you a different pair of glasses. And you suddenly go, wow, I did not see that. So the correlations are fantastic. And when you get into it, the correlations are really, really, really exciting, because it can take you to places you just didn't think of. So I understand it's fundamentally what you're asking, and couldn't quite articulate it because it's hard, is why are all these things connected? And I don't understand the relationship, because it's systemic.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Good question, by the way.
Thank you.
So we have a few more minutes, I guess, and then...
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Nousala. Thank you, Atika. Anybody else? If not, then thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor. And
thank you so much. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
Now, Vineet, would you please thank Doctor on everyone's behalf, please?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Susu. It has been really a privilege for attending your session with you. So even I'm doing a system project right now. I'm currently in my final year, and this project, your session has been very helpful to me and to others as well who have attended this session. So I mean, do send us your contact details if somewhere now or in future, if we can get in touch with you for more system design and design innovation projects. So it was a wonderful session, and I hope all the faculty members and the students, all of us have enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you so much, and I'll be more than happy if you can share more knowledge with us and enlighten us with more of system design and design innovation projects.
Oh, I'd love to.
Thank you
I'd love to.
so much.
Really great. Thank you. And thank my very good colleague, Salmi, who's from Cumulos. We've known each other many years. So, yeah. So that was nice contact. Okay.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you all.
Thank you. So I'll see you then. And if you want to get in contact with me, just email me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Can you write down your email ID in the chat?
Oh, in the chat. Yeah, sure. To everyone. Okay. I'll give you both. And then the other one is, did you go up? Yeah. So I put up to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just
thank you.